Well, these recent storms and really the weather conditions of the past few seasons really have probably caused you or someone you know to have some issues with their trees. Maybe the trees have dropped on your house, maybe taken lines down and so forth. But certainly I know in my world has raised the level of anxieties oftentimes among neighbors about that tree limb that's reaching over the yard, or even the thing that's lifting the concrete outside their on their pavement. So, in an effort to launch the conversation about plants and trees anywhere that it'll go, we want to talk a little bit about some of the legal aspects that you may expect when you start talking about trees. And to help me break all that down, Karl Rominger, attorney from Rominger Law, is with us here this morning. And my friend Eric Vorodi from About Trees Consulting in Boiling Springs is here. And I think this is going to be a lot of fun because I know for me, the only time I really talk to lawyers about tree stuff is when I've just been sworn in and behind a microphone sitting by the judge. Thanks for coming in.
Hey, no, my pleasure.
So, this whole business about trees, so to speak, what area of law covers that? Because it seems to me that in, the cases that I get involved with, and to a greater extent, since I'm less involved in it than Eric, many times these are issues that seem unsettled. I mean, it just doesn't seem to be any settled law about that.
We call it assumpsit or trespass in the civil arena, and trespass is probably more applicable to trees. Assumpsit is contracts, although you can imagine that if you had a delivery of trees from a nursery, we could end up in a contract-style action. But just talking about like neighborhood disputes, people fighting over, whose tree fell and why, whose car was damaged, etc., that falls under a concept called trespass, and that's when you go on to somebody else's land or something you do affects somebody else's property.
So trespass seems to me to be an easy thing for anybody to kind of fall into. As a practitioner, I can be trespassing if I'm trying to prune some branches from a neighboring property. If I'm planting something on a border, sometimes the roots of the plant or whatever kind of get involved with sidewalk or infrastructure on neighboring properties. What does, and again, I guess it gets down to, let me ask you the question about common law. Right. What is common law, and why is it so difficult to figure out?
Well, Pennsylvania is a common law state. In fact, almost every state in America is, with the exception of Louisiana. But the idea of the common law is that we take decisions from the past and we rely on them in making decisions in the future. The flexibility is that as times change and new information becomes available, or, nobody anticipated cell phone towers, 50 years ago. The law can flex a little bit to handle those things because we can say, well, let's treat this new item the way we treated this old item. And that's what the lawyers argue about and the judge decides. The bigger thing, I guess, is also with common law, it draws its history back over hundreds of years so that we have these concepts of stare decisis, or things that have been decided in the past. And once the law is well settled, it helps a person make decisions. The problem is which case to apply becomes down to what facts are true. So you talked about the roots growing into somebody else's land. Did you know those roots were going to grow onto the other guy's land? Did you pick something that was known to do that? How close to the boundary did you plant it? All those little factual differences can then change which law we should apply. And then there's an overlay that the legislature can create statutes as well. And then those would control or even take over or abolish the common law in an area. So for instance, in the horse arena, we have Equine Act that allows people to be free from lawsuits if a person rides a horse as long as they follow the act. I'm not aware of any laws on trees, though. The legislature has not really, to my knowledge, done much to codify the law of trees or trespass.
And that which is what makes it interesting for folks like us. And Eric, jump in there. Is there any laws or statutes that you're aware of that apply to trees? I'm thinking about treble damages in the case of an injury to a tree that's malicious.
Yeah, but one of the things that happens is oftentimes, and you'll see this particularly if there's a young lawyer involved, you may have a urban tree in an urban setting that is a landscape tree, and it's part of the landscape. And you'll see them using language relating back to forestry cases from way back in the history of Pennsylvania, and timber trespass you'll see cited, and then you'll see things like double damages if it was negligent or triple damages if it was malicious. And sometimes that can apply if it's a forestry situation, but 99% of the time when I'm involved, it's more of an urban or suburban landscape tree situation.
So let's walk it back a little bit. The thing that I get called on or asked to remark about most commonly is issues where a tree, it may or may not be on the boundary, the branches are reaching over a house, it's dropping leaves in the gutter and so forth. The neighbor who feels offended sometimes feels empowered to take some action to remedy that. All well and good, particularly if you can't see what happens, but sometimes, and maybe not as a cause, but a coincidence, the tree deteriorates, and now the person who took this action is, getting beat up.
Yeah, and I get the question now, what do I do? My neighbor's branch is hanging 10 foot over my property line. My advice is to go through a careful series of maneuvers, which is go over and talk to the neighbor. And it's amazing how many of these cases can be resolved when you simply say, have you talked to your neighbor? And they go, no. Well, ask your neighbor if they'll cut the branch down. And if they say no, ask for permission to cut the branch down. But then don't just cut the branch down yourself. Hire somebody like one of you guys who's an expert on trees, or somebody who's a tree trimmer by practice, and have them do it so they don't infect the tree or ruin the tree. And they put I don't know what the stuff you guys paint on the end of the branch.
Oh, no, we don't do that anymore.
No, okay.
No.
Well,
no.
See what I know. I would.
So you'd be out there painting if we called Karl Rominger
That's right.
to trim your trees, which is why you're not a tree trimmer. In fact, and there's something for you. If you encounter a case where somebody painted stuff on the trees, that is considered bad practice these days.
Yeah, that's been for 20 years or so. That's been out of the practice.
And that's why I encourage them to get somebody who does it for a living. And the thing is, if the other side technically, wants to handle it, let them. But if they don't want to, get their permission. And if you can't get their permission, and you've sent letters, you can take self-help. But I always say that's at risk. So the other thing, the more expensive thing you can do is then go to a court and say, my neighbor's branch is a nuisance, and I would like the judge to order them to take it down. And then the judge can decide who's going to help take it down and at whose expense.
All right. 243-1200, 697-4297, and 1-866-532-9466. Way to get a word in edgewise. Karl Rominger is here along with Eric Vorodi, and we're talking about trees, curiously enough, and some of the legal wrangling that gets involved when that becomes the topic of discussion. And remarkably, a remarkably unsettled area from my standpoint and my experience. And remarkably, while many of us embrace the idea of trees in our community and around our neighborhoods, we neglect to realize that many of these things get very large and sometimes, susceptible to problems resulting from storms and hurricanes and all that sort of stuff. So that's where things get dicey between neighbors and so forth. Eric.
But you brought up one of the most common things is my neighbor's tree is encroaching on my property, and what can I do about that? Can I cut that limb off or force him to cut it off? But along those same lines, what happens sometimes is when you identify that your neighbor's tree may be at risk of falling onto your property, and then you'll call someone like me, I'll come out and verify that, yeah, I think the tree has some risk factors as well. And that concept of self-help, I hear that and have never been comfortable understanding what it means. And so if that's the case, and I'm asking
right.
You've identified, or I've identified for you, that your neighbor's tree has many significant risk factors, including that it could fall on you or your house, damage you or your house. Then what becomes your options?
And the self-help option is the one that lawyers would always tell you, don't do, although it's available at your own risk, so to speak. But you don't have privilege to enter their land, so that's a little rub. Because in order to, say, take down a tree or do something major, you're probably going to have to trespass into the airspace at least, if not the ground of the neighbor. And that you're not privileged to do. And that's where you're going to have to go get a court order in order to do that. Now, I guess if you were called to the scene and the tree was literally teetering, I can imagine a scenario where it looks, the big wind is coming up and we've got a hurricane forecast and the wind's supposed to come in and the tree's literally so close to falling that you say, oh my gosh, I'm going to risk being second guessed on this and take this tree down. And maybe a judge says later, yeah, you did the right thing because even though you weren't privileged to go on, it was a matter of defending your own property or your own safety. And we're not going to hold the trespass against you, but it's still a trespass. And so it could still be held against you if it's decided that there was no exigency or emergency circumstance.